He told himself he didn't need anyone. Not a neighbor, not a pastor, not a grief counselor with a box of tissues on the table between them. Certainly not a dog. That was the thing about Lorne McKay. Wait, no, that name's taken. That was the thing about Fen Ashby. He had spent 22 years in the Navy, most of them underwater in places that didn't appear on any map, learning how to be invisible, how to be still, how to need nothing. He had been good at it. Exceptional, even. His commanding officer once said Fen could outlast a stone wall. At the time, Fen had taken it as a compliment. He wasn't sure anymore. The farmhouse sat at the edge of a gravel road outside Ingersoll, Ontario, surrounded by fields that had gone fallow the autumn his wife died. Judith had been the one who kept things growing. The kitchen garden, the window boxes, the big maple at the side of the house that she'd strung with lights every December without being asked. When she was gone, the lights stayed in the garage. The maple didn't seem to mind. It went on budding and dropping and turning and dropping again, indifferent to the absence of the woman who had loved it. Fen tried to be indifferent, too. He had been home 3 years, medically released after a training accident. Nothing dramatic, nothing worth a documentary, just a shattered kneecap and 2 vertebrae that would never quite forgive him. And then home to Ingersoll, to Judith, to the farmhouse that smelled like her baking for the first 6 weeks and then gradually like him, like coffee and boot rubber and silence. She had been sick when he came home. He hadn't known how sick. She had not told him how sick, because Judith had been the kind of woman who protected people from things they couldn't change, and Fen being 10,000 kilometers away was something she could not change. Pancreatic cancer. Fast. Brutal. The kind that didn't negotiate. He had 8 months with her. 8 months of being the person he should have been for 22 years. Home for supper, awake at 2 in the morning when she couldn't sleep, holding her hand during the treatments she eventually asked them to stop. He had been good at that too, in the end. Present. Still. He hadn't known that the skills that made him a good operator would also make him a decent man to die beside. She went in April, when the fields outside Ingersoll were just starting to soften. The grief counselor, whose name he had already forgotten, told him that grief was not linear. Fen had nodded and never gone back. He spent the first year getting through the days. The second year he started running again. 5 kilometers in the morning on the gravel road, even in January, even when the temperature dropped to -20, and the fields on either side went white and absolute. Running felt honest. It asked nothing of him except forward motion. The third year, he stopped expecting things to get better. That wasn't despair, exactly. It was more like a settlement, the kind you reach when both sides are tired of fighting. He would live here, in this house that had been theirs and was now only his. He would manage the land badly and maintain the truck well and drive into town for groceries on Thursdays. He would be fine. Fine was enough. He did not want a dog. He had never wanted a dog, or at least that was what he had decided, somewhere in the second winter. When the neighbor 2 farms over, a retired schoolteacher named Patsy Drummond, had started leaving casseroles on his porch with notes suggesting he might benefit from a companion animal. Fen had eaten the casseroles. Patsy was an excellent cook, and left the notes unanswered. Dogs needed things. They needed feeding and walking and veterinary appointments and emotional investment. And they died, eventually, always, and Fen had already used up most of his capacity for loving something that was going to leave so. No dog. That was the position he held on a Thursday morning in late October, when he came back from his run and found the animal in the ditch at the end of his laneway. She was a German shepherd, or had been once. She was thin in the way that meant she hadn't eaten properly in weeks. Ribs visible through her coat, hips sharp as fence posts. And she was lying on her side in a shallow depression in the ditch where the gravel met the dead grass, and she was not moving, and Fen's first thought, standing there in his running gear with his breath coming in white clouds, was, not my problem. His second thought was that she was still breathing. He stood there for what felt like a long time looking at her. She was tricolored, the classic saddle of black across a tan body, with a pale streak along her muzzle that gave her a slightly elderly look, though she wasn't old. 4, maybe 5 years. Her ears were pinned flat against her skull, either from cold or fear or both. She turned her head and looked at him. Just that. She didn't growl or whimper or scramble away. She looked at him with amber eyes that held no accusation in them, only a kind of exhausted patience, the look of an animal that had been waiting a long time for something and had almost stopped waiting. Fen said, out loud, to no one, "Don't." He went inside. He made coffee. He stood at the kitchen window drinking it and looking out at the ditch, where he could just see the shape of her in the dead grass, the pale stripe of her muzzle. He poured a bowl of the beef stew he'd made on Monday, and he carried it outside. She ate without lifting her head, just turned her nose toward the bowl and worked through it slowly, methodically, like she knew she shouldn't rush. When it was empty, she looked up at him again. "I'm not keeping you," he said. He called the county shelter. They told him they were at capacity and could take her in 4 days. He built her a shelter out of a Rubbermaid bin and an old sleeping bag, and set it at the base of the maple tree, because it was the most sheltered spot in the yard, and because Judith would have done the same thing, and he didn't examine that thought too closely. Her name in his head only for practical purposes, became Grit. She was in the bin for one night. The second morning he found her on the porch, not scratching at the door, not whining, just sitting there facing the fields like she'd taken up a post, like she'd decided something in the night and was simply waiting for him to catch up. He let her in because it was 6 degrees and dropping. "Temporarily," he said. Grit walked directly to the fireplace. Fen hadn't lit it in 2 years, sniffed the cold grate, circled twice, and lay down with her nose on her front paws. She looked, Fen thought unwillingly, like she was home. He lit the fire. For warmth. For himself. Not for her. The shelter called on day 4 and said they had a spot. Fen looked at the phone for a long time. Grit was lying across his feet, which she had started doing on day 2, apparently having identified his feet as the warmest and most stationary part of him. He could feel her breathing. Even and slow. "She's healthy," he told the shelter. "Someone's been looking after her. She's not a stray, not technically." This was not entirely true. She had no chip, no tags. But she was house-trained, leash-trained, and she obeyed the few commands he'd tried. Sit, stay, wait, with a precision that told him she had been trained by someone who knew what they were doing. A working dog, maybe. Or the dog of someone who'd known working dogs. He hung up without arranging the transfer. "Don't read into that," he said to Grit. Grit's tail moved once against the floor. Just once. Like she was agreeing to keep it between them. October became November. The fields went from dead to frozen. Fen ran every morning. Grit ran with him, matching his pace without being asked, which annoyed him in a way that also pleased him. And he didn't examine that either. She had a ground-eating stride, efficient, quiet, no wasted motion, and she ran without pulling at the leash, which he gradually stopped using because there was no one on the gravel road at 5:30 in the morning to object. At night, she slept on the floor beside the bed. He'd put a blanket down for her, an old wool one of Judith's that he'd been unable to donate. The first night she'd slept on the blanket. By the second week she'd migrated to the foot of the bed itself, installing herself there with the quiet authority of someone who has reviewed the arrangements and found them insufficient. Fen found he didn't mind. He found he didn't mind a number of things he'd been certain he'd mind. The hair on the couch cushions, the click of her nails on the kitchen floor at 6 in the morning when she decided it was time for him to be awake. The way she pressed herself against his leg when he sat at the kitchen table drinking his coffee, not demanding attention, just present, just there, as if proximity itself was the point. He started talking to her. Not at length, not the way he imagined lonely people talk to pets, narrating their day, asking questions, filling silence for the sake of filling it. Short things. Observations. Weather's coming in. Probably ice on the road tomorrow. This soup is better than Monday's. Grit received these reports with the same gravity she received everything, ears swiveling slightly, amber eyes steady. She was, Fen thought, an excellent listener. She did not offer opinions or alternatives or silver linings. She simply acknowledged that the thing he'd said had been said. Judith had been a good listener too, but she'd been constitutionally incapable of not offering her perspective. He had loved her for that. He hadn't realized, until Grit, how much he'd missed it, and also how much, sometimes, he just needed someone to hear. The first real trouble came in December. It was a Tuesday early afternoon, and Fen was in the barn that served as his garage and workshop. trying to change the brake pads on his truck before the worst of winter set in. Grit was lying near the barn door, watching the fields. She'd been watching the fields a lot lately, ears up, focused, tracking something Fen couldn't see or hear. He was under the truck when she barked, once. Sharp. Not her something's moving in the long grass alert, which was quick and curious. This was different, lower, certain. He came out from under the truck, at the edge of the property, near the fence line where his land met the empty field that had been for sale since he moved in. There was a dog. Small, maybe 20 pounds, brown and white, moving in tight, anxious circles near the fence post. Even from a distance, Fen could see it was shaking. Grit barked again, not at the small dog, at Fen. "I see it," he said. He walked out to the fence. The small dog was a beagle, and it was not in good shape. One of its back paws was swollen to nearly twice its normal size, caught in, or recently freed from, given the raw skin, a rusted wire that had come loose from the fence. It had been out here for a while. The ground around the fence post was churned from circling. It looked up at Fen with eyes that were too bright, the glassy brightness of an animal running hot with infection. Fen looked back at the gravel road. No cars. No one coming. "Right," he said. He called the emergency veterinary clinic in Woodstock because it was Tuesday, and the regular vet in Ingersoll was closed Tuesdays. He described what he was looking at. They told him to bring it in. Getting the beagle into his truck was a project. It was frightened and in pain, and it snapped at him twice. Not viciously, just reflexively, the way anything in pain will warn you before it lets you help it. Fen was patient. He'd dealt with worse. He wrapped it in his barn jacket, got it to the truck, settled it on the passenger seat. Grit, who had watched this whole operation from 3 feet away without interfering, jumped into the back seat and lay down with her chin on the center console 2 inches from the beagle. The beagle stopped shaking. Fen looked at Grit in the rearview mirror for a moment. She looked back at him, perfectly calm. "Don't," he said. "This is temporary." The beagle's paw had a bad infection but no permanent damage. The vet in Woodstock, a young woman named Dr. Fairweather, who had the brisk, no-nonsense manner of someone who'd been woken up by bad news enough times to stop being startled by it, cleaned and dressed the wound and said the dog would need antibiotics and rest and quiet for 2 weeks. "Any ID?" Fen asked. "Chip, actually." She looked at her screen. Registered in Hamilton. Owner moved to a long-term care facility in August. No next of kin listed on the record. She looked up. "He's been loose since August, probably. 3 months. 3 months of fields and fence lines and no one coming." "I'll take him," Fen said. He heard himself say it and did not take it back. Dr. Fairweather looked at him for a moment, at the barn jacket, the running calluses on his hands, the way he was holding the beagle with the competence of someone who was not afraid of animals even when they bit him. "You've got another dog?" she said. "She found me," Fen said. "Apparently this is a pattern." Dr. Fairweather smiled. "The good ones always do." The beagle came home. Grit accepted this with the equanimity of someone who had already predicted the outcome and was simply waiting for the paperwork to catch up. Fen named the beagle Soot, for no good reason except that he was brown and gray. And the name arrived fully formed one morning when Soot was sitting in a shaft of winter light on the kitchen floor, looking like a small creature who had survived something and was cautiously considering what came next. Soot was nothing like Grit. Where Grit was measured, he was chaotic. Where Grit observed, he investigated. Every corner of the farmhouse, every inch of the barn, every object that could be picked up in a beagle's mouth and carried to a location that made no practical sense. The wool blanket from the foot of the bed ended up in the bathroom. Fen's left boot ended up under the kitchen table, with a sock he didn't recognize folded neatly inside it. A throw pillow from the living room was discovered, 3 days after its disappearance, in the cabinet under the bathroom sink. "I didn't do it," Soot's eyes said every time. Enormous, liquid, completely unconvincing. Grit, on these occasions, sat at a precise distance from the crime scene and looked at Fen with an expression that could only be described as diplomatic neutrality. "You could have stopped him," Fen said. Grit looked away. She had opinions but was not sharing them. The farmhouse, Fen realized one evening in January, was loud. Not loud with noise. They were a quiet trio on the whole, but loud with presence, with the small ongoing business of 3 creatures coexisting. The click of Grit's nails on hardwood, the soft huff of Soot investigating something behind the couch, the sigh of both of them settling at night, Grit at the foot of the bed and Soot inexplicably on top of Fen's legs, despite having a perfectly adequate dog bed 18 inches away. He had not felt the house around him as a place where things were happening in a long time. He sat with that for a while, not moving, just listening to the January wind outside and the breathing of 2 dogs inside. Judith had always said she wanted a dog. He'd always found reasons to put it off. Deployments, operations tempo, the impracticality of a pet when he was never reliably home. "When you're done," she'd said. "When you're home for good, we'll get a dog." He hadn't been home for good in time. He pressed the heel of his hand against his sternum, where the familiar tightness lived, and breathed through it the way he'd learned to breathe through difficult things. Slowly, without fighting. After a moment, Soot climbed up his shins to his thighs and turned twice and settled, boneless and warm, and the tightness didn't go away, but it changed, slightly, the way a thing can change when something small and alive presses itself against the place that hurts. February brought the worst storm of the winter. Fen had spent the day before it arrived stacking wood, checking the generator, buying enough groceries to last a week. He was, by inclination and training, someone who prepared, who read the conditions and acted before the conditions became a problem. He had been doing this his whole adult life. It had kept him alive in places where the alternative was unacceptable. The storm arrived on a Thursday night. By Friday morning there were 2 feet of snow on the ground, more coming, and the kind of wind that turned the laneway into something you couldn't navigate without losing sight of the barn from the house. He didn't go for his run. Grit sat by the door for 20 minutes, patient, hopeful, unwilling to say it out loud, and then went and lay down near the fireplace, making clear through the slight compression of her brows that she considered this a regrettable day. Soot, who had never met a weather system that changed his fundamental worldview, continued his program of investigating the house with the thoroughness of a building inspector. At noon, Fen's phone showed a voicemail from Patsy Drummond next door. He almost didn't listen to it. He and Patsy had a civil but careful relationship. She brought food, he thanked her. They both pretended the casseroles weren't motivated by concern. But something in him, old instinct, the kind that had never steered him wrong, made him play the message. Patsy's voice was steady, but underneath the steadiness was a quality Fen recognized, a person holding together. Her husband, Glenn, had slipped on the porch steps that morning. He'd fallen badly. She'd gotten him inside, but he was in a lot of pain and she wasn't sure the hip was all right and she didn't want to worry anyone. But the road looked impassable and she didn't know. Fen was putting on his coat before the message ended. He looked at Grit and Soot. "Stay," he said. "Both of you. I mean it." Grit sat. Soot looked at the ceiling, which was his method of technically complying with an instruction while registering philosophical disagreement. Getting to Patsy's farmhouse, 400 meters up the road, took 25 minutes. The snow was hip-deep in the drifts. The wind pushed back against every step. Fen put his head down and moved forward, because that was what you did when conditions were against you. You moved forward. There was no other option that mattered. Glenn Drummond was 73, a former dairy farmer with the particular toughness of men who have gotten up at 4 in the morning in the dark, and cold for 5 decades without complaint. He was sitting in the kitchen armchair when Fen came in, pale but upright, one hand gripping the chair arm with the determined grip of someone trying to convince their body, and the people around them that this was manageable. It wasn't entirely manageable. Fen looked at the way he was holding his left leg, slightly extended, not bearing weight even sitting, and made the call. Hip possibly broken. Definitely broken. He called 911. He explained the road conditions, the location, the situation. The dispatcher was calm and methodical, and she told him an ambulance would be dispatched, but given the road conditions he should be prepared for a wait of 90 minutes to 2 hours. 90 minutes, Glenn said when Fen relayed this. "I've waited longer for rain." Patsy brought tea. Fen sat across from Glenn and they talked about the storm, about the land, about the winter. Glenn had gotten a tractor stuck in the creek bed in 1987 and had to walk 7 kilometers back to the house in -30. Glenn was a man who understood stories as a form of structure. something to hang a long weight on, and Fen sat and listened and asked questions, and was more grateful than he knew how to say for the practice, accrued over 3 years of silence, of simply being present without needing to fill the air. The ambulance came in an hour 40. Glenn went to the hospital in London. Patsy went with him. Fen walked back to his own house in the dark, into the smell of wood smoke, and the immediate warm weight of Grit pressing her head against his thigh. He stood in his kitchen with snow melting off his coat onto the floor, and he thought about Glenn's voice. Steady, trying to manage, too proud to have called anyone, and about Patisi's voicemail, the thing held together underneath it. He thought about Judith, about how she had not told him how sick she was. For the same reason, protecting him from a thing she could not change. He thought about how all the people who were supposed to be fine, who had learned to seem fine, sometimes needed someone to walk 400 meters through a blizzard and sit across from them and stay. He hadn't known that, or he had known it in theory. They'd covered it, obliquely, in the debrief sessions he'd mostly slept through. But he hadn't understood it as something that applied to him, as a thing he could be, not just something he might need. Soot climbed onto the couch beside him, stepped on his knee, turned around twice, and pressed himself against Fen's ribs with the confident certainty of a small animal that has calculated the exact geometry of comfort. "All right," Fen said. Not to Soot specifically. Not to Grit, who had settled across his feet, just out loud to the kitchen and the fire and the dark fields outside. "All right." Glenn's hip was broken. He had surgery in London and came home after 3 weeks to a ground-floor bedroom and a walker, and strict instructions from the surgeon that were delivered in the kind of tone that implies they are not suggestions. Patsy drove him. Fen plowed their laneway. He had started doing this sometime in January, clearing their laneway when he cleared his own, without discussion, without being asked. He wasn't sure exactly when it had started. He was sure that he'd noticed, one Thursday in January, that the lane was drifted in and the lights in the Drummond kitchen were on at 6 in the morning, which meant Patsy was up early and the lane wasn't clear, and he had a plow attachment for the tractor, and so. He didn't mention it. Patsy left a pie on his porch. He left half of it for her the next day. This was how things worked, out here. The pie said everything that needed saying. Glenn came home in early March, when the snow was just starting to pull back from the south-facing slopes. He called Fen on a Tuesday evening. They had exchanged numbers during the ambulance wait and said simply, "I hear you've been doing my laneway." "Machine needed the hours," Fen said. There was a pause. Then Glenson said, "Judith would have liked knowing you were here." Fen didn't answer for a moment. He was standing at the kitchen window, and outside, Grit was chasing something through the snow. A squirrel. Probably, futilely, the squirrel already long gone up the maple, and Soot was sitting on the porch watching her with the expression of a creature who has considered athleticism and found it unsound. "Yeah," Fen said, "I think so too." Spring came the way it always did in Ontario. Not gradually, but in sudden surrenders, the snow retreating from the fence lines and the south slopes while the north-facing fields held on for weeks more patches of white in the brown, the maple began to bud. The fields turned from frozen to muddy to something that might by May be workable. Fen started talking to a man in town, not a counselor, or not officially. His name was Breckin Solares, a veteran himself, Royal Canadian Regiment, 2 tours in Afghanistan. He ran the hardware store on the main street and could talk for 40 minutes about the mechanical properties of wood screws, while conveying underneath a comprehensive understanding of what it was to come back from somewhere difficult, and find that the coming back was its own difficult thing. They talked, most Thursday mornings, over coffee at the counter of Breckin's store while the early customers moved around them. They didn't always talk about hard things. Sometimes they talked about the hockey, about the spring planting, about the relative merits of different tractor brands. But sometimes they talked about other things, and Fen found, to his ongoing surprise, that he could do that. That he had more words for it than he'd thought. Grit came with him, Thursdays. She lay under the counter with her chin on her paws, and was treated by Breckin's regular customers as a fixture of the store, receiving pats and small tributes of dog biscuits from the jar by the register. Soot came twice and was found in the plumbing aisle, times, apparently investigating the structural integrity of the display. He stayed home after that. One Saturday in April, Patsy Drummond knocked on Fen's door. This was unusual. Patsy left things on porches. She did not knock, but there she was in her good coat, holding something wrapped in a towel, her expression carrying the particular combination of apology and determination that Fen had come to recognize as preceding an event he had not consented to. The thing in the towel moved. "Before you say anything," Patsy said. "I'm going to say something," Fen said. "There were 5 of them. I found homes for 4. She held out the towel. "This one was the last one, and I've been carrying her around for 3 days, and Glenn is allergic and I can't." The puppy looked up at him from the towel. She was small, black and gold, with ears too large for her head and the dazed, wondering expression of a creature for whom everything is still extremely recent. She had, Fen noticed, a white star on her chest. Small, irregular. Like someone had pressed a thumb there gently. He took the towel. "She's 7 weeks, Patsy said with the exhale of someone who has been holding their breath. "Shepherd mix. I've got her first round of shots done." "You planned this," Fen said. "I have been waiting," Patsy said carefully, "for the right moment." She went down the porch steps. Halfway down she stopped and said, without turning around, "Judith used to talk about getting a dog. Did you know that?" Fen looked at the puppy. The puppy looked at him. Grit appeared in the doorway, assessed the situation, and sat down beside Fen's leg in a posture of restrained but undeniable interest. "I knew," he said. Patsy nodded. She got in her car and drove away. The puppy's name was Flint, which did not seem, on first inspection, like a name for something this small, but she grew into it. She grew into everything. The name, the house, the particular chaos she generated in the first weeks that made Soot seem, in comparison, almost professionally restrained. Flint chewed the corner off the wooden steps stool. She removed the insole from Fen's right boot and hid it in Grit's water bowl. She discovered at 11 weeks that she could bark, genuinely and loudly, with the full conviction of a creature who has found a superpower and intends to test its range. And she applied this discovery enthusiastically to squirrels, the wind, shadows, the click of the furnace starting, and, once, the moon. Grit, who had taken on the role of senior officer with characteristic gravity, corrected her with a look. Just a look. Steady, measured, carrying the full weight of Grit's opinion of unnecessary noise. Flint would pause, reconsider, and then inevitably bark again 3 minutes later. Soot watched all of this from the couch with the expression of a philosopher who has seen civilizations rise and fall. The farmhouse was loud now. Not aggressively loud, not TV loud or radio loud or the loud of a house filled with things being played at volume to cover silence. Just occupied loud. The sound of 3 animals and 1 man living alongside each other in the practical, unromantic, ordinary way that living things do when they've made their arrangements and settled in. Fen ran every morning. Grit ran with him. Soot ran for about 8 minutes, and then made it clearly understood that he had covered his physical obligations for the day. Flint ran in large, erratic circles around them both. He tended the fields that spring, not all of them, just the kitchen garden Judith had kept, along the south side of the house. He put in onions and tomatoes and the climbing beans she'd liked. He was not a skilled gardener. The beans got off to a difficult start, and 2 of the tomato seedlings didn't make it past the 2nd week, which Grit observed from a respectful distance as though attending a small funeral. But the onions came up, and by July the remaining tomatoes were doing something purposeful. And Fen stood in the garden on a Wednesday evening in late summer, in the long Ontario light that lasts until 9, with dirt on his hands and Flint investigating a beetle 6 inches from his left boot and Soot asleep against the garden wall, and Grit sitting beside him watching the fields. And he thought about Judith. He thought about her often. Still, he didn't think this would stop. He didn't particularly want it to. She was the best person he'd known. And the shape her absence made in the air was just the shape of her, maintained. He carried it the way he carried his knee. Managed, present, occasionally loud when the weather changed. But standing there in the evening garden, with dirt on his hands, and the smell of tomato plants, and 3 dogs doing their separate, unremarkable things around him, he thought about what she'd said, "When you're home for good, we'll get a dog." He'd been home for good for 3 years before he understood that home for good wasn't a destination. It was something you did, slowly, with whatever showed up and needed something from you, and with whatever you were willing to need in return. Grit pressed against his leg. Her weight was solid and warm and completely without agenda. He put his hand on her head. "Yeah," he said. "I know." The maple at the side of the house had started to turn. Just the edges of the leaves, the first suggestion of October, gold at the margins. In a few weeks, the whole tree would go. Then it would go bare, and the winter would come, and he would stack the wood and check the generator and clear the Drummonds' laneway without being asked. And the dogs would run with him, or not, according to their natures, and the house would be loud with them. And that, Fen Ashby had finally learned, was enough, more than enough. It was the specific, unglamorous, irreplaceable weight of a life that had room in it for things that needed you, and that was what coming home, finally and for good, was actually supposed to feel like.